All right. Okay, welcome. AP Lit Workshop. If you all go to your English OneNotes, right, your teacher should have, fingers crossed, put this section in there, right? So we're going to be working from this, right? So if you would open up your OneNotes right now and find the section in your content library that says Lit AP Resources 2020, 21, 22. Does anybody not have that? Hey, and who are you? I'm sorry, Joshua Barrett. All right, fantastic. Do you mind letting the attendants know that he's actually here? Oh, Joshua's here. All right, and Joshua, we are in this resource here in your OneNote. Okay. All right, so what are we doing today? Today, I'm giving you an overview of the exam, right? We're going to talk about the multiple choice sections a little bit, right? I've included a couple of practice multiple choice sections. You are going to get an overview of the open prompt and the literary argument. You're going to get an overview of the poetry section. If we have time and we're not exhausted, right, we will do some, we'll respond to an AP poetry prompt. But if you take a look at these dates, right, there's this big gap, right? We're meeting today, and then there's going to be another couple of these sessions near the end of next month. That's like the week before you'll be taking this test. What I'm going to do is between the 25th, that is today, and the 27th of April, there are going to be some morning review sessions, optional ones, where you can pop in and ask me or other English teachers who are there questions about the multiple choice, questions about like the responses, the poetry responses, and so on, right? Those I will be sending emails out to y'all, letting you know when those optional pop-ins are. So you can come by, because we're not going to sit here and do an entire test together and then go through the whole thing and so on and so forth. But by the time you get out of here, you'll have a good sense for what this thing is, what's expected of you, and how you can find some success. I can tell you this, that if you just come to these sections and do nothing else, you're not going to be that well prepared for this test, right? You need to do some work outside of this, right? In order to, if you're striving to get at least a 3, and some of you a 4 or 5, you're going to need to do some work, right, outside of these sessions, right? So that's why we'll have those optional pop-ins. You know, if you want to get a Princeton review of some kind or one of those things, not a bad idea. But you're going to get some good instruction here, and I'll be recording these other 2 sessions as well, right? Hey, Brian. Brian Feng is here as well. All right, Brian, we're in this Lit AP Resources page, right? So you can go there. Let me make sure I am recording. I am recording. All right. Okay. So the first thing, right? I'm going to the first subpage here, right? This overview of the Lit. What does this test look like, right? It's a 3-hour exam, like most AP tests, right? And you have section 1, which is multiple choice, and section 2, which is free response. Free response means essays, right? The multiple choice, you're going to get probably about 55 questions, right? The multiple choice is 45% of your overall score, right? There tend to be 5 sets of questions made up of 8 to 13 questions each. And the questions are going to include excerpts from prose fiction, drama, plays, or poetry, right? And each of those excerpts, right, is accompanied by several multiple choice questions. There's going to be at least 2 prose passages, right? That might include drama, and probably at least 2 poetry passages, right? Now, the question is, this is not a content-driven test. They don't expect you to have read any of those excerpts, right? They want to see how well you can read and write about literature and understand literature and read critically, the same skills that you've been learning sort of in English class all along, right? So chances are you're not going to recognize those prose passages or poetry passages. It doesn't matter. They're going to give you a little bit of framing for each one, and we'll take a look at what that looks like regarding the multiple choice. We're also going to go over some tips for multiple choice shortly, right? And I've sent you a PowerPoint on that. We'll briefly go through that in terms of strategies for maximum success on multiple choice, right? Then 55% of your score is on the 3 essays that you're going to write. There's going to be a poetry analysis one that we'll talk about today, right? They're going to give you a passage of poetry. They're going to give you a prompt about it, and you need to write a quick essay, right? And we'll talk about what those essays look like, right? A prose fiction analysis, that would be either probably a passage from a novel, possibly a passage from a drama, a play. Again, a thesis that presents a literary interpretation, as it says. And then finally, the literary argument, which we're going to go into in more depth right now, shortly. It's also called the open prompt. You'll be presented with a literary concept or idea and analyze how that concept or idea contributes to an interpretation of a literary work. They're going to provide you a list of possible works you can draw from, or you can come up with one of your own, a work of literary merit. And we're going to look at that today for sure, because this is the one section over which you probably have the most control, right? Because you need to prepare for that for sure. You can't just go in cold. It's a big, broad theme-based question that's going to apply to any number of literary texts, right? So we're going to look at that today as well to see what that looks like, right? So overall, right, it's a 3-hour test, right? And if you sort of do the math here, you'll probably spend about an hour on the multiple choice. You're going fairly quickly, right? So that leaves you 2 hours for 3 essays. I'll repeat that. That's 2 hours for 3 essays. So we can do the math, I think. That's 40 minutes per essay. And you're like, whoa, I always take my time with essays and so on. The AP folks are aware of that. They're aware that you're writing under the pressure of time, right? They're aware that it's not going to be your most polished work, but they want to see what you can come up with. And we're going to talk about strategies for writing a quick essay, right? Response, right? You need to, and we'll be looking at that today. Essentially, that gives you time for the poetry and prose response to read over the passages, to read the prompt, to quickly try to do some annotation and a quick outline, 10 or 15 minutes of prep, and then you just barrel through, right? Unlike in English classes where we ask you to do like a good introduction that draws the reader in, your intros will probably be very short. You're going to get right to the point. You'll do 2 or 3 paragraphs of analysis, right? And then a conclusion that could be very, very short as well, right? So the intro and conclusions can be short and to the point. They're really looking at, does this kid know how to write an argument, present a thesis, analyze the text? In other words, the very skills that you've been learning freshman year onwards through your junior or senior years, literary analysis, which some of you are very, very good at, even if you don't particularly like it all the time. Those are the skills that this test is keying you in on. So I think most of you are probably advanced English class students, right? You do more analytical writing than those who are doing standard. And that kind of advanced work, more of your grade comes from your analysis, right? We largely base that on the fact that the AP is asking for you to showcase those skills, those very skills. So things like thematic claim and textual focus and DDIST style analysis, guess what? That's this test, right? So in a lot of ways, you're already ready for it. The challenge is to be able to then like crank out those 3 essays in 2 hours. And we'll be talking about that today. So that's a general overview of the test. Are there any immediate questions about that? Fantastic. Let's keep going, right? So what I wanted to do now is just show you where some multiple choice sections are and talk to you a little bit about some multiple choice strategies. But Sam has a question, so. Uh-huh. What do you mean by what is it actually split? Is someone timing you and giving you track? Nope, you're timing yourself. Yes, you need to keep track of time. There are no timekeepers. You are your own timekeeper, right? So if you like sit there on one essay and you spend an hour and a half on that, you've got 30 minutes to do 2 essays. You can't do that, in other words. So you got to be very, very strict about time management, right? And again, we're going to be talking about strategies for that. Christian, you had a question? They're going to be handwritten. You don't have the option of writing them unless you have some kind of special accommodation, but yeah, they'll be handwritten. And we'll practice that today too. Yes, tell me your name. Yes, go ahead. Body paragraphs, 2 to 3. You know, I don't think you'll need more than that. I don't think you'll have time for more than that. We'll look at some student samples, right? You'll see that intros can be very short to the point with a good thesis statement, 2 to 3 cranked out body paragraphs, a conclusion, even if it's just 2 or 3 sentences, something that, even if just repeating points, right? Like we tell you in English class, let's do more in a conclusion than just summarize the points you've made, like try to end on a stronger note, bring in a new idea. Not the case now, you don't have the time. So now it is okay in your conclusion to very quickly just summarize like, you know, 2 or 3 sentences of summary. They're looking at that thesis statement. They're looking at the analysis you do to make sure that you're not summarizing, but you're making an argument, that you can analyze the text. And they're also looking at, you know, how skillful, like, do you write with sentence variety? Can you use good vocabulary, right? Those kinds of skills, right? Other immediate questions come to mind before we move forward? So let's talk a little bit about the multiple choice, right? The AP is notorious about not sharing, for some reason, multiple choice passages, but we have two, right? And so here is a multiple choice section, right? From 2012, right? When you open this up later, you'll see what this thing looks like, right? And it says time, 1 hour, right? And it says stuff like, note, pay attention to requirement of questions that contain words not least except. Then you've got like, here's a poem, series of questions about it, right? There's a prose passage, series of questions about it, et cetera, right? So that is what that looks like, right? And then there's an answer key included as well, right? We also, there's also another exam, the 2004, and these are very highly representative. They're not dated at all. I can tell you that, right? They're all following the same kind of format that I mentioned before. But we provided for you 2 practice exams and 2 answer keys, and we are going to go over these during those optional pop-ins, right? I've gone through these tests myself, took them myself, right? So I know the ins and outs of all the questions. What you can do is complete this on your own before those optional pop-ins, which won't be next week, but probably the week after that, right? Build some time in to go through these. And then just circle the ones that you got wrong and try to understand, why did I get that one wrong? And can you understand why the right answer is right and why the wrong answer is wrong, right? And then come by and we can have very quick sort of reviews on those things, and we can go over the ones that you want to go over, right? So what I'm not going to do is have a review session where I go through every single one of these questions one by one, right? What you want to do is put yourself on the clock and do these 2 practice things and see how they go, right? Now, all that sounds interesting, right? If you want more practice for the multiple choice, that's what the Princeton Review and those sorts of things, they can provide you with more of those. We've got 2 for you here with these answer sheets and so on, right? So let's talk a little bit more about strategies for the multiple choice, right? Because there are some tips to keep in mind. And if you look at, let's see here, I believe I sent this your way, right? So you've got this PowerPoint, and I'm going to go through this relatively quickly and just review these a little bit with you, and then see if you have any questions. So the AP, right? Test taking tips. Let's check this out here. Let's not try that now. Let's go from the beginning, right? Okay. All right. I think I've mentioned that before, right? 5 sets of questions, 8 to 13 questions each, 45% of the overall exam score. They come from prose, fiction, drama, or poetry, right? I've covered this basic format before, right? But let's go through some general tips here, right? The next slide, right? Recommend that you go in order, right? They're all the same level of difficulty. Some might be more trickier than others. You'll be delighted to know that it's a relative scale. You are being assessed relative to how every other student in the country, right, does on this. So some of the questions might be a little trickier than others, but they do a statistical analysis of all the questions, right? And so if you get one right where more people got it wrong, that could play to your benefit. They have like calculators that go through all of that, right? Right on the exam, definitely right on the exam. It's yours to annotate on. You're going to get passages and questions, right? You can, this is from last year, it says the annotation tool, but you're going to be able to write on the exam itself, right? Circle phrases, et cetera. Scratch paper, highly recommended, right? This is from last year, right? You can go back. So last year it was tricky, right? You couldn't go back on these. This is no longer the case, right? But have scratch paper regardless, right? Because you can take notes as needed. Make sure you don't get bogged down on any one question, right? If you get to one that you're not fully sure on, right? Skip it, go back to it, right? You can come back to it later. And keep in mind that just because a passage is long doesn't mean it's more difficult than shorter passages. Sometimes the most difficult passages are the poetry ones. A brief poem, which can be kind of complex, and those can be trickier than the longer prose passages. And I think what you'll see is in the 2 multiple choice sections we gave you, that some are definitely easier than others, right? So they're going to give you a sort of variety in that sense. Let me keep going through here, right? Don't fight the question or the passage. They're giving you everything you need to know about it, right? Again, you're going to get passages you haven't read before. That's the whole point. They want to see how well you can read critically and whatnot. And if there's any background information that you need to know, they'll provide it there alongside the passage. They'll also sometimes have a couple of footnotes with some information. That's typically important, right? Consider all the choices given, keep an open mind. Sometimes later questions will contradict an answer to a previous one, right? Some basic tips, right? Let's keep going here. I think this first part is tricky, right? The AP is notorious for giving you like, here are some 5 possible answers. And it's usually using the process of elimination, right? It's usually the case that you can eliminate 2 or 3 of those, and then you're left with 2 that look like they're plausibly good answers to the question, right? One is always better than the other. And it could be that one that's plausibly a good answer, like the elements in the response there, right? These couple of elements seem true, right? But one is false. So one piece that is false makes the whole thing wrong, right? So every part of the answer needs to be correct. And I think when you do these practice tests, you'll see what this means, right? When in doubt, go back to the text. Don't worry about the app part, right? That was for last year, right? Read the directions prior to the test to save time. Poetry passages, you can't do this year out loud, right? But you certainly can read them carefully, and we're going to review poetry in a little while. This is important. Date, intro, info, as I mentioned before, they will give you the info you needed, the extra sort of contextual information that you might need on these passages, right? All right, there's not too many more slides here. Types of questions, right? There they are. Inference is you pull out the meaning. It's not explicitly stated, but you're pulling it out given the context of the of particular lines. They'll ask you to identify and interpret figurative language. There's a resource in here where I give you a long list of different kinds of figurative language that you should familiarize yourself with, most of which you probably already know. Things like metaphor, simile, personification, understatement, overstatement, hyperbole, etc. There's some literary technique stuff, some character analysis, overall passage questions. The overall passage question is like the passage as a whole is conveying this, right? Structure, grammar questions, right? You will see this as you do the practice tests, right? Format of questions, there they are, right? These are really annoying, right? Because they have these like, which of these is correct, right? 1 and 2 only, 1 and 3 only, 1 and 4, 1, 2, and 4, right? Those are maddening, I know, right? But you can expect to get some of those, right? Maybe 1 per passage, 1 or 2 per passage. Remember, there are 5 passages, right? You'll definitely get those kinds of Roman numeral answer types, right? You also get some line-specific ones, like they'll say in line 18, when the author uses the phrase blah, 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 they most likely mean, right? When you get those line-specific questions, you want to basically go back and read the few lines before that line and the few lines after that line. In other words, you want to put the whole line in context, right? Meaning is not going to necessarily be embedded in that one line. In fact, most of those line-specific questions are put that line in context of, right, the sentences before, the sentences after. So you want to put those specific lines in context, right? They'll give you some definition vocab questions. In the context of this passage or this piece, what does X mean, right? And even if you don't know the word or the phrase, you can probably infer it given the passage itself, right? You'll get these questions. All of the following are present except, that's where you need to just cross them out, cross the ones out that aren't going to address that one. And then there's some self-contained questions like identifying figurative language, right? All right, almost done here, folks. Techniques, there they are. Process of elimination is your best friend, for sure, right? Some things are going to be transparently wrong. You cross those out immediately, so clear that off your mental plate, right? There's substitution, fill in the blank, using context for meaning. Anticipation, sometimes you'll probably get at least 2, if not 3 of these questions, and you'll see this when you take these practice tests. The next stanza in this poem or the next passage in this prose piece would probably emphasize, they're asking you to anticipate what would come next, right, in this prose piece. And the way to answer that is to go back and read the ending of the prose piece, right, the last paragraph, and think about the implication of what would come next given the ending, right? Then there's intuition, educated guess. Finally, when run is timing out. A few things you can do: scan the remaining questions, look for the shortest questions, the ones that point to a line, look for specific detailed definition questions, look for self-contained questions, answer all the questions, right? All right, I know I'm going kind of fast here, but I think, use this in context when you take the practice test. A lot of this, after you take the first one, you can, before you take the first one, go back and review this, right? And apply some of these strategies. Now, finally, the score, as it says here, right? The higher your multiple choice score, the less pressure you have to earn 3 high scores in the essay portion and vice versa. The goal is ultimately to try to answer at least 30 questions correctly, right? And here is a scoring calculator that you can use, right? After you've done a couple of practice tests, but 30 is typically what you're shooting for, right? So how many questions are there? 55, right? So it's okay if you're not getting all of them right. A 30 or above still puts you in pretty good stead to get 3 or higher on the AP test, right? So they're challenging questions, right? It's not going to be easy, but again, it's a relative scale. You are being sort of judged relative to everyone else taking the test. So that's there for you. Are there any questions right now about multiple choice? Yes. I'm sorry, can you say that again, Sam? I think it's just correct, right? And then they do that statistical analysis of, how did everyone do on particular questions? Yeah. Other questions? Okay, so if we go back to where we were, and we're going to take a couple breaks here as when needed, right? These two, I'll send out email reminder next week, right? We won't have any drop-ins next week, but probably the following week, right? We'll do some drop-ins for for either of these two multiple choice. So just, I would say, put it on your calendar, build in 2 hours the next couple of weeks to do these practice tests. Again, go back through them, circle the ones you got right, review why you got why the ones that you got wrong, circle the ones you got wrong, review the ones you got wrong, and see if you can understand why the right answer is right, and then come by and talk to me, and any other English teacher will give you some quick feedback on that multiple choice. Okay. All right. So, there is giving you an overview of the exam. I've quickly talked about the multiple choice section, right? I want to jump to the third of the 3 kinds of essays that you'll be asked to write: the literary argument, the open prompt. What is that exactly? And we're going to talk a little bit about the major works data sheet. So here's where we're going to go. If you scroll down, right, to this thing here called the open prompt, the literary prompt. Oh, before we do that, let me cover one quick thing, right? The essay grading scale. It's the third down. The essay grading scale, right? How are your essays graded? You have all these people pulled together, AP readers, right? Who read through your essays holistically, and after each of your essays, they slap a number on it, right? An 8, a 6, a 4, whatever. And then that person, that all gets sent to the table leader, and the table leader sort of does a reading as well, and they make sure that the scores coincide, right? So it's holistic grading, right? And essentially, if we look at this scale, this 1 to 9 scale, we can lump some of these together. Like an 8 or a 9 would be upper range, right? Those are the stronger essays, an 8 or a 9. And we're gonna give you an example of what that looks like. What does an 8 or 9 actually look like, right? A 6 or 7 is what's called upper mid-range, right? That's the equivalent of what it might look like, right? And then 5. Believe it or not, 5 is mid-range, right? And if you get a 5 on one of your essays and do better on the other 2, you can still do well on, it depends on how you do in the multiple choice and so on. But I would say that most Carey Academy students going in, right, judging the writing that that you produce, and the fact that I've done this for so long, Carey Academy students at baseline basically start 5 or 6, right, if not stronger, right? So I don't think anyone here will be getting 4 or below. You're all advanced students, right? You can write strong essays. 6 or 7, again, we'll call that upper mid-ish range. 8 or 9 are the stronger essays. What do those look like? We're going to be talking about that and seeing some student samples of that, right? So that's the scale that they use, right? All right, let's go back to this open prompt thing. So if up until this point, I've been a voice in the background that you've not been tuning in on too much, now's a good time, right? Because I want to talk to you carefully about the essay thing. Like the multiple choice you'll do on your own and so on, but essays, there's some real specific strategies that we want to talk about. Like, how do you prepare for these? Now, it's called the literary argument, the open prompt, because it basically lets you write about whatever book you want to write about, as long as it fits the prompt that they give, right? And so if we look here, I've given some examples of 3 open prompts, right? And then I've given some examples of some student thesis statements to them. And we're going to look at them right now. So here is the first one, right? This is very typical of what these open prompts look like, right? I've basically taken this right here, right? And I've put it up here, right? The prompt itself. So I'm looking at the top of the page, right? This is what an open prompt looks like, right? Many works of literature feature characters who have been given a literal or figurative gift. The gift may be an object. It may be a quality such as uncommon beauty, significant social position, great mental faculties, or extraordinary physical powers. In other words, what is the gift? It's how you can define it given a particular character. Yet this gift is also often a burden or a handicap. Select a character from a novel, epic, or play who has been given a gift that is both an advantage and a problem. Then write a well-developed essay analyzing the complex nature of the gift and how the gift contributes to the meaning of the work as a whole. Okay, let's break this down first of all, right? The first thing you want to be aware of with this is genre, okay? It's going to say novel, epic, or play, or it'll say novel or a play. I would steer you towards novels or play. And you're also wondering right now, like, how on earth would I prepare for this? You're going to need to know at least 3 or up to 5 good literary texts, right, of strong value, right? Because you don't know what the prompt's going to be. This is a prompt that can apply to any number of literary texts, but if you only prepare by reviewing one literary text backwards and forward, you're taking a big gamble. If you review and do some work on 3 or 4 or up to 5, you're probably going to be safe here, right? Note that what it doesn't say here, it does not say memoir. Some of you have taken the memoir class. Don't review memoirs, right? It doesn't say nonfiction, right? It's a novel, epic, or a play, right? Epic would be an epic poem, right? Like the Odyssey. But I would stick to novels or plays, because they always ask about novels or plays. Occasionally they'll throw epic in there. So novels or plays are the things you'll need to review independently. And I've got a resource here which shows you how to prepare for this section. Right now, I just want to talk about the nature of the prompts and what they're asking you to do, right? So let's take a look at the rest of it. The first thing is you're going to look at a character who's been given a gift that's advantage and a problem. Then write a well-developed essay analyzing, as it says here, the complex nature of the gift and how the gift, this is super important, contributes to the meaning of the work as a whole. 9 out of 10 of these, almost all of them are going to have that phrase, contributes to the meaning of the work as a whole. In other words, they're asking you to provide a thematic interpretation. When you look at the complex nature of the gift that a character gets, why is that thematically significant? So think thematic claim. Where have you heard that? In every single one of your English classes. You're making an argument not about just a character, right? But how the complex nature of this gift that this character has suggests a thematic idea. They want to see that you can make an argument about an idea, right? So what would that look like, right? And first of all, this is what the actual prompt looks like here. And notice what it says afterwards. It says that you may choose a work from the list below or another work of comparable literary merit. Do not merely summarize the plot. It's going to say that every single time. Now, you're going to be given this list and it's like, oh my God, I did not prepare with any of these. I don't know most of those. They're not expecting you to know most of those. You prepared 3 to 5 novels and or plays in advance. One of them will probably fit this theme-based, right? And so it doesn't have to be on this list. When it says a work of comparable literary merit, it means basically anything you've read for English class other than the memoir course, right? All of those are definitely game. Avoid genre fiction, right? Young adult literature? No. Spy novels? No. Romance? No. I'm not saying those things are detective novels? No, right? I'm not saying those are bad. There can be some really strong ones, but it's a work of comparable literary merit, something of literary value. It can be a classic, it can be something contemporary, but virtually any book in any of your English classes, that's comparable literary value, right? Any immediate questions about that comparable literary value thing? Okay, fantastic. So let's go back to the prompt itself. And what I've provided here is a structural model for a thesis, right? With the bold-faced purpose for verb. A thesis might look something like this: through, and then in brackets, what you pinpoint as the complex nature of the gift your chosen character receives or displays. The author illustrates what you pinpoint as how the gift contributes to the meaning as a whole. That's what the thesis should ideally look like. So what does an actual thesis like that look like? If we look at this, here's a thesis of a student who wrote about Henry James, The Portrait of the Lady. I don't think any of you have read that. Doesn't matter. But look at the way the structure of this thesis works. This student got an 8, right? And if we look at this thesis, right, we see the two parts, right? Here is part 1. I'll highlight that yellow. Isabel's Archer gift of a large inheritance gives her the advantage of moving more freely as a woman in society, but also makes her more vulnerable to being seen by others as a tool. You don't stop there though, okay? Because if you do that, you're just doing character analysis. You're just talking about the complex nature of the gift, right? Why is that important? Look what comes next. Highlighting the novel's depiction of the woman's disadvantaged role in society, right? So there's that thing called the thematic claim. You wonder why your English teachers bang you on the head with this over and over again, right? Because that's what they are looking for, right? They're looking for you make an argument about an idea. You're not just talking about Isabel Archer and how she is both moving more freely and more vulnerable, but how that illustrates a larger idea, right? So if we look back, right, notice that I'm color coordinating all this. The complex nature of the gift, how it contributes to the meaning of the whole. This thesis does that quite well. And then the essay itself was an 8-ranged essay, right? Questions about that? Let's look at 2 more, just so you get a sense for that, right? Maybe we'll look at 2 more and take a quick 5-minute break or something like that. The 2008 English AP, or excuse me, the 2000, what was this from? Let's see, I thought I had that down too. It doesn't really matter, they're all kind of the same, right? But here is the prompt, right? And I front loaded it up here, right? Select a novel, play, or epic poem. Again, note genre, right? I'm going to suggest to you to pick novel or play, because for some reason, epic is not always included. I don't know why. Select a novel, epic, or play that features a character whose origins are unusual or mysterious. Then write an essay in which you analyze how these origins shape the character and the character's relationships, and how the origins contribute to, guess what? The meaning of the work as a whole. Have we seen that before? Yeah. Can you expect to see it? Yes. What does meaning of the work as a whole mean? Your thematic claim about the text. Here's what you will not say. You will not have a claim about a character and say, and this character's struggle illustrates the meaning of the work as a whole. As soon as you've said that, the AP reader's going to roll their eyes. They're going to say, okay, they didn't even come up with their own thematic claim. You need to come up with that, right? So if we look at this, right, it's again, 2-part piece. How the origins shape the characters and that character's development. We'll highlight that yellow, right? But you don't stop there. And how the origins contribute to the meaning of the work as a whole. Right, we'll do that blue again. The 2-part shuffle, right? And there's a structural model. A thesis might look something like, through what you pinpoint about how your character's mysterious origins shape him or her, as well as their relationships. The author reveals that overall meaning is a whole thing, right? Again, the way that we've been sort of teaching you to write thesis statements. Remember, you need a textual focus. Don't just do character analysis, connect your character analysis to an idea, a larger claim. That's the AP. That's the AP, right? So what does it look like, right? Here's a student got a 9, right? So the thesis was strong, but also obviously the development of the thesis was also quite strong, right? So let's take a look at it, right? And this was on Leslie, they chose to write on Leslie Marmon Silko's Ceremony, fantastic book by American Indian writer. Tayo's unusual origins reflect his personal struggle, especially as he lingers upon a personal identity between white and being native, offering critical commentary on cultural integration between natives and whites throughout the 20th century. So there's that first part. You don't just stop with the character. You don't just stop with the character, right? He has these mysterious elements for this one was, right? He's torn in two between his white and his native identity. And that ultimately suggests this larger idea, right? It's not accidental that these stronger thesis statements, right, are answering the prompt as they're meant to be answered, right? Notice what doesn't happen in the blue section. It doesn't say, you know, his personal identity between being white and being native, right, suggests the meaning of the work as a whole. No, no, no. You've got to define that, right? Why is it important? You need to know why it's thematically significant, right? And again, right, notice how the question that we just went over, it's the same thing. They're going to give you a laundry list of all of these different texts. And notice what it says right before the laundry list. You may choose a work from the list below or one of, guess what? Comparable literary merit. No Harry Potter, no YA stuff. Those books are fantastic, but you need a book of comparable literary merit. Don't summarize the plot. Ceremony is not included there. Doesn't matter, right? The student got a 9, right? It's not that they expect you to have, you might have read some of these. Maybe you've read none of them. It doesn't matter. Can you answer the prompt? Have you prepared for this, etc. Right? All right, we'll get one more, just to show you how this thing just like repeats itself over and over again, right? I think I have, yeah, I've already done this sort of highlighting here, but let's take a look at this next one, right? Many works of literature contain a character who intentionally deceives others. Ooh. The character's dishonesty may be intended either to help or to hurt. Such a character, for example, may choose to mislead others for personal safety, to spare someone's feelings, or to carry out a crime. Choose a novel or play. There it is, right? You will always see novel or play. We don't see epic this time, right? So again, novel or play, you're safe, right? Choose a novel or play in which a character deceives others. Then, in a well-written essay, analyze the motives for that character's deception and discuss how the deception, guess what, contributes to what? The meaning of the work as a whole. There it is, right? So you don't stop at the yellow. If you write a nice essay about how this character is deceptive and I'm going to show you the motives behind this character, that's good character analysis, but you're not connecting that to a thematic claim. You got to say why that's important. So what? The character is always deceiving people. And you can tell me the motives behind that character deceiving people, but you're not telling me why that's thematically important, right? So you get to that thematic claim thing, right? And here is one more thesis, right? This student chose to write about Theodore Dreiser's An American Tragedy. This student got an 8. It's a very strong score, an upper range level. And notice how, you know, your textual element could be pretty short, right? I'm just going to look at Clyde's evasive behavior, right? Clyde's evasive behavior speaks for the rapacious greed of industrial America. It speaks for the insatiable desire of the consumer society and the addictive nature of wealth, beauty, and possession in the eyes of capitalism, right? And I notice when I look at a paper like that, like I know what the student's going to write about, right? I also am aware as an AP grader that the student, right, is writing under the pressure of time. So if this student had developed this over a week, right, and submitted this, I would say this is a good thematic idea. It's probably a little bit wordy, right? I think that could be condensed a little bit, but that they're not, the AP at the mantra at AP is reward students for what they do well. They're aware that you're writing under the pressure of time. So it may not be the most polished thesis statement you've ever written. In fact, it won't be. But they want to see that you can very quickly put together an essay, right? How long should these be? 2 or 3 body paragraphs, a quick conclusion, right, etc. Right? And here is the prompt itself. And notice, again, the way that they frame it. It says, you may choose a work from the list below or another work of, guess what, comparable literary merit. Don't summarize the plot. They say that every single time. There's a list of possibilities, but those aren't the only possibilities, right? Okay, so that in a nutshell is the open prompt, right? The literary argument. And you're probably thinking right now, well, how am I supposed to do well on this? What do I do to make this work for me? And this is how you do that, right? If you go to the next subpage, right? We'll have an open prompt workshop down the line, right? Or you can certainly come by and talk to us about your ideas. This is the one, as I mentioned before, part of the test that you have the most control over, right? And you have to do this preparatory. If you don't do any work on this open prompt business, right, you're not going to do well here because they want you to know some works left and right. So here is what you will need to do for at least 3 texts of literary merit. At least 3, right? 3 novels, or 2 novels and a play, or 2 plays and a novel. I would suggest maybe 4 or 5. Here is this major work status sheet. Okay, so you want to do this for at least 3, if not more, right? And you want to go back and refamiliarize yourself with something, right? You're reading Toni Morrison's Beloved, fantastic, you love that, right? You read Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, dystopian literature. That's of literary merit. You read, think about what you've read, grades 9 through 12. What are the books that you wrote successfully on? You can go back to your old papers. What are the books you really identified with and liked that you would be willing to go back and review? And then this is what you want to do, right? Let's go through it just briefly. Title, author, date of publication, genre. Probably for genre, it's just literary fiction, right? And I don't think you need to worry too much about date of publication. They don't care if you know what the date of publication is, but just, you know, is there any historical information about the period that you should know? Maybe a little bit. Biographical info about the author. I don't think you need to belabor that too much because you're not going to be writing about the biographical background, but it might be relevant. Like F. Scott Fitzgerald, right? He wrote Great Gatsby, and he was certainly part of that kind of age of the Roaring 20s. But that can be very light. You don't have to go overboard here at all, right? This first page is just a little bit of background information. Then a plot summary. I would say to just put it in your own words, right? What is the overall plot, right? And you don't have to go overboard there. So this first page is just a little bit of background. You do that. The next few pages are more important, right? This is what you should spend time on. The major work status sheet, at least 3 good quotes, if not more, right? And a quotation and their significance, right? Are they asking you to quote from the text? Not at all. They're not asking you to quote from the text. Are they asking you to back up your claims by being able to reference specific examples from the text that you can recall? Yes, that is what they're doing. So even though it says here quotation, you don't need to memorize quotations, but this is a good way for you to go back and extract some passages that are thematically significant or significant about characters. It's a good way to review what's important in a text, right? Again, you won't be quoting from the text, but you will be writing about the text and showcasing your knowledge of it. You're making points and you can refer to specific examples to back up your points, right? So there's that memorable quote piece, right? On the next page, characters. Know them backwards and forwards. Notice that the 3 prompts, right? All of them ask about characters. Some of them ask about setting. Some of them ask about passage of time, but a lot of them are character heavy. And you'll write about characters probably anyway. So who are the characters in that novel or play? What's their role in the story? Why are they important? And then what are some adjectives you would associate with that character, right? That can be really handy, right? If you're writing about Hamlet, right? Indecisive, crafty, manipulative, right, etc. Whatever character you might be, just you have sort of an arsenal of characters that you've sort of reviewed, arsenal of adjectives that you can sort of use. So you're not just saying like he's a good character or a bad character, right? You get to know the characters really well. On the next page, definitely do this setting. I've seen several, right? Setting questions, right? So settings are important, right? Where does it take place, right? What does the setting have to do with the significance of the work as a whole, right? The opening scene and the closing scene, those are good ways to think about how a novel begins and how it ends. And then symbols or motifs, right? At least 3, if not more, right? What are some sort of recurring images, motifs, symbols in the work? And then possible themes, right? Have at least 3 or 4, right, that you can articulate. And then for those themes, like, what are some passages that suggest that? What are some examples that suggest that, right? In other words, you're getting to know the novel backwards and forwards, or play for that matter, right? So this is what you need to do on your own, right? You want to do at least 3, if not up to 5. Start that, please don't start this like the night before the test or the weekend before. Give yourself a little time to really sink into that and, be prepared for that part of the test. That is the open prompt, right? And again, next week I'll send out some these days we'll review the multiple choice. On these days we'll review open prompt if you would like. But this is basically the kind of thing like just do the work. Just do the work. You really need to, right? I've had students before tell me that I really only prepared one novel kind of, and that didn't work out so well for me. You might get lucky, but you probably won't. If you do 3 or more, you're probably going to be fine with these broad theme-based questions. Okay. Let me go back to this. Questions? Riley. No, it's created like this. They read your whole essay, and then they slap a number on there. They give it a holistic grading, in other words, right? And that sounds so subjective. They know what they're doing, like just as we do. Like they can tell they've been grading student writing for a long time. What's sophisticated? We'll look at some examples during one of the review sessions of some of these open prompt responses, right? Yes. You want to sort of try to focus on one particularly different from each other? I think so. Yeah. If you choose 3 that are all works of dystopian literature, no, I would pick one, maybe one work of if you liked one of the books in dystopian literature, great, go back to that, right? But don't pick all of your texts from the same course, even if you absolutely adore that course. So yeah, 3 to 5 books that are different, right? They're dealing with different kinds of themes, different sorts of settings, different sorts of characters, right? Other questions about that? Fantastic. All right. I've been talking for a while. We're going to get into the poetry, but I know I need a little break. You probably could stretch as well. So how about it is 1:54. Let's reconvene at 2. Let's stretch, bathroom, etc. Let's do that real fast. And let me pause this Zoom meeting. Let's pause the recording. Okay, let's get back to the joy. So a couple of things. Keshav asked a really good question, right? I'll just reiterate. He was like, yeah, I'm going to go back and review some text. Maybe I like to read. I might read some other books on my own, but he was wondering, if I wanted some feedback on, whether these are texts I should be looking at or they're of literary merit. Can I? Of course, you can ask, right? So feel free to ask me or any of your English teachers precisely that question. You might have a list of 4 or 5 books, and you're wondering, are all these good ones to prepare? And maybe you already sense that they are, but something as easy as a Teams message to me or any of your teachers, hey, Mr. Yu, would these work out? And I'll say, yeah, all 4 of those are great. Go forward with that. And if there's, if I have a reservation about one of them, it's 3 of those look good. I'm not sure about this one. Maybe you choose a different one. But again, the point is you want to know 3, 4 books. I heard someone mentioning Doll's House. That's fantastic. That's a play, right? Maybe you do that, right? And that appears on lists oftentimes, right? And again, avoid things that are nonfiction. You've been in the memoir class, you've read some really great memoirs. Tara Westover is Educated, right? Wonderful book, but it's not going to work for this, right? They're asking for works of fiction here. The other thing that I'll send out later is what is a good student response to the open prompt look like, right? And I'm going to send that out to y'all later, right? Next week sometime. I'll send it to everyone who's taken the test, and I'll frame that with here are 3 student responses. The first one is an upper range, the second one's kind of middle, third one's lower, and you'll see what they are looking for in terms of quality, right? And I think those upper range responses, that's the kind of work that I know that Carey Academy students are capable of producing, right? So don't be anxious about that. You'll get some specific examples of what those kinds of responses look like for the open prompt. I was just talking to Riley, when you go back and you look at some quotations, no, you don't have to memorize them. The reason we're saying to pull out some significant quotes is because that's going to get you rooted into what's significant in the book, right? And in your body paragraphs, unlike in a literary essay where you got your topic sentence and then you quote from the text and then you analyze a quote, for the open prompt, you'll have your topic sentence right? And then you'll cite an example from the text. You'll give just a little bit of background, and then you'll talk about why that example, right, illustrates your thesis's thematic claim, right? So you won't be quoting, and you're not expected to quote, but they do expect familiarity with the text, right? That you can call upon particular examples, right? Not quotations, but like when you're talking about, I don't know, The Handmaid's Tale, you're making a claim that you can give one or two quick examples in that body paragraph and talk about how that, you're not summarizing, you're making an argument. Okay, so that will be forthcoming to you, those examples, those student examples of responses to the open prompt. Questions about open prompt before we move forward? All right, so let's go back to this. We have covered the overview. We've talked about the multiple choice and how you'll be doing that on your own, and I'll be sending out reminders about that when there'll be some pop-ins that you can come by, right? We've talked about this open prompt and the literary argument. You've looked at that major work data sheet. You've got to do that on your own. You've got plenty of time. Please don't start the weekend before the exam. Start thinking about that sooner rather than later. And now we're going to do a quick overview of the poetry section. We're going to, if we have time, we'll see where we are and whether we're exhausted or not. We might do some practice on that, right? So again, there are 3 written responses, 3 essays: the poetry prompt, the prose prompt, and the open prompt. We just looked at the open prompt. We're going to put the prose prompt aside for now, because that's basically they're going to give you a passage from a novel or a play for you to analyze and forge a thesis-driven essay around. I think the poetry is oftentimes the most challenging for students. So I want to start by just highlighting this page here that says useful poetry resources documents, right? And if you go there, right, excuse me, let me see the prose prompt. Where is it? Yes, right. There are a couple of documents here, right? You know, when you're preparing for this one, let's look at this useful poetic terms real fast. Right, let's project that for you, right? These are a whole heap of poetic terms, and I've highlighted the ones that you probably want to go back and shore up on and review before the test, right? A lot of them you've seen before. Some of them you may not have, but all of these sort of definitions includes examples. So you look here, sound devices like alliteration, assonance, blank burst, caesura, right? You can look at that on your own, but you're like, what is that? Some of these you've, I think, seen, right? When we get to stuff like figurative language, free verse, hyperbole, exaggeration, an image. We do a lot of work on image and imagery, irony, metaphor, right? Metonymy, ode, onomatopoeia, on and on and on. So again, some of these are very familiar to you, some of them less so, right? Like setting and simile, I think you're comfortable with that. Sonnet, probably want to review that a little bit, right? Stanza, remember when you're writing about poetry, you would never refer to a paragraph. You would refer, a section of a poem would be a stanza. And you wouldn't want to talk about narrators in a poem, you would talk about speakers, the poetry, or you could refer to the poet itself, tone, understatement. Again, some of these you're familiar with, some of this you shore up on. So that's one thing for you to review, right? And then I also have these tips, right? Things to think about when you think about interpreting poetry. When you think about poetry, there is a speaker. And the speaker is presenting some sort of dramatic situation, typically, right? And you think about, all right, there's some kind of drama going on. A lot of times it's an internal drama. It's a drama about, it could be about social class or gender. It could be about some kind of internal sort of emotional conflict, right? But the first thing is to pay attention to who is the speaker, right? Who's talking? What can you glean about the speaker's age, gender, station in life, opinions, feelings, right? What does the poem reveal about the speaker's character, right? Is the speaker speaking to someone else, right? Only to the reader, right? Is there a dramatic context for the poem, right? What happens in the poem, right? There's always something happening. There's some conflicts going on, some thematic ideas being batted about, right? We'll look at some poems together, or poem together, and talk about this question about what is happening in the poem, right? Motivations for speakers, the language of the poem, How is it organized? I'm not going to go through these and read these out loud, but a couple of resources, right? This is just a 2-page one, right? For you to consider before, as you start preparing for this poetry prompt. And I think you'll probably prepare more for the poetry than the prose, right? Because I think poetry is a little bit more complex. And that's always the case for everyone taking this test. I think that of the 3 essays, the poetry prompt is the trickiest. I think students just generally have more difficulties with poetry than with prose, generally speaking, right? On that first page, I got a couple of samples. We'll look at those later, right? But right now, let's pay attention to this, the poetry prompt, this page right here. And I'm wondering if I need to plug in or not. Oh, let's hope we have enough. All right. Okay. So what I've done here is I have collected 3 different poetry prompts, structural models, and student samples. In other words, the same thing that I did for the open prompt, right? I've done here again with the poetry prompt. I've also done this for the prose prompt. We're not going to we don't have time to cover that today, but the prose prompt, I've given examples of prompts and strong thesis statements and so on, right? So let's take a look at this first one real fast, right? And this is what the thing looks like. Notice how it's not that long, right? This 2018 poem, poetry prompt on this poem called Plants, okay? I've front-loaded the prompt itself here. Let's just take a look at it together. Carefully read Olive Senior's 2005 poem, Plants. Then in a well-organized essay, analyze how the poet portrays the complex relationship among the speaker, the implied audience, and plant life. You may wish to consider the author's use of such literary devices as syntax, diction, and figurative language, right? So it's asking a couple of things here, right? And they're going to say something like this: you may wish to consider the author's use of such literary techniques as, right? There they are. These things, right? Does that mean you have to analyze all of those things? No. I mean, it might be the case that you just look at different forms of figurative language and base a 2 to 3 body paragraph essay around that. Figurative language and diction, you could just limit yourself to that. Syntax means sentence structure, right? But they're not going to count off. If you write a strong essay in which you examine diction, that is word choice, and figurative language, some similes, metaphors, controlling metaphors, and it's a strong essay, you're still going to get an 8 or a 9, right? So they're giving you sort of like, these are the things that you may want to consider. You'll probably consider 1 or 2 of them, maybe all 3 of them, depending on what your essay ends up looking at, right? Now then, what does a structural model for a thesis look like? Kind of like the ones before, right? Through the particular techniques you'll examine, whatever those are that you define, the speaker illustrates whatever it is you pinpoint as the complex relationship among the speaker, the implied audience, and plant life, right? We're going to read this poem together in a second, right? And I'll show you some student responses to it. Let's right now just look at the structure for what a thesis looks like, right? Okay, so what might this look like? This is a student, thesis of a student has scored an 8, a strong essay, right? And note that the student here used 2 sentences rather than 1, right? Typically, you want to try to nail down a thesis in 1 sentence, but they understand that you are working under the pressure of times, okay? So if you get it in 2 sentences, but you're addressing the prompt well, and you have a strong argument, that is fine, right? Again, the AP mantra is reward students for what they do well, right? So let's take a look at this here. The speaker warns the audience not to underestimate the clever machinations of plants, characterizing them as manipulative beings whose goal is to take over the world. The speaker argues points through sinister diction, personification of plant life, and direct address to the audience. So here is the kind of big thematic address of the poem right there, right? This is the argument I'm going to make, right? This is what I think the complex relationship among the speaker, the implied audience, and plant life, right? And I'm going to show you that that's the case by looking at these 3 things, right? 1, 2, 3, right? And notice What the student does well here is define their terms, right? They don't say the speaker argues his points through diction, personification, and direct address, right? There's a defining of the terms: sinister diction, personification of plant life, and direct address to the audience, right? So if you go back, right, there really isn't an explicit reference to syntax, right? But this direct address to audience, right? If you do that and do it well, fantastic. You can look at that, right? But this kind of sets up what you would do in 2 or maybe 3 body paragraphs, right? So that's an example of still a strong thesis. It's just in 2 sentences rather than 1, right? Let's look at a couple more structural models, then I'm going to show you what a strong student full response looks like, right? Let's go to this next one. Okay. The myth of music for my father, right? So here is the prompt. The following poems by Rachel M. Harper. Read the poem carefully. Then consider such elements as imagery, form, and tone, and write a well-organized essay in which you analyze the relationship between music and the speaker's complex memories of her family, right? So this is what you want to look at, right? You're going to analyze a relationship between music and the speaker's complex memories of her family. And what should you look at? These elements. Consider those kinds of elements, right? Imagery, form, and tone. Form would be the sort of basic structure, right? Is there, how many stanzas is it? We'll look at that in a moment, right? But can I draw your attention to what I have highlighted in yellow here, right? Analyze the relationship between music and the speaker's complex memories of her family. That one's not asking for a thematic claim necessarily. It's talking about the speaker's complex memories of her family. So you want to define what that is. That is the sort of argument you'll make. There's a structural model, you know, through these particular techniques, the speaker suggests what you pinpoint as that relationship. What does that look like? Here's an 8, right? And notice how this student frames her, or their, I should say, thesis in the same way that I set up that structural model, right? So we have the, I'm going to look at these couple of techniques, right? We'll put that green, right? Through her use of comparative metaphorical language and auditory imagery, right? Harper conveys, and here is the answer. This is what I'm going to look at. The timeless and uniquely personal nature of music and its ability to evoke the emotionality of her childhood to her father, right? So notice the way in which what I've highlighted here connects back to, right, the corresponding colors there, right? And notice this first part, right? The defining of technique, that is important, right? Here's what you don't say. Through the use of tone and imagery. And I know your English teachers have told you before, because that doesn't mean anything, right? Tone and imagery doesn't mean anything if you don't define it, right? And here, tone isn't even being focused on, right? It's basically comparative metaphorical language and auditory imagery, right? Fantastic, right? Imagery can sometimes be kind of a loose term, and sometimes images are functioning as metaphors. So here are 2 things, right? Now, notice how a thesis like this kind of writes what you're going to do in body paragraphs, right? Because in body paragraph 1, what are you going to do? Comparative metaphorical language. I'm going to focus on that and how that hammers home this piece of yellow here, right? And in body paragraph 2, what will I look at, right? I will look at auditory imagery, and then how the auditory imagery is conveying the same idea, the timely and unique personal nature of its music and its ability to evoke the emotionality of her childhood to her father, right? So this sounds basically like the stuff of English class, because that's exactly what it is, right? When your teachers tell you to define your terms, you know, what are your textual elements? What's your textual focus, right? This person is showing us that they can do that well. Comparative metaphorical language and auditory imagery. But then it's always like, okay, so why is that important? You're focusing on that part of the text in order to showcase what? In this case, this notion about the speaker's real complex memories of her family and how music comes into play with that, right? We'll look at one more. All right. Here is, right? One more of these. The following poem by Richard Wilbur, first published in 1949. Then write an essay in which you analyze how the speaker describes the juggler and what the juggler reveals about the speaker. Notice this is not a thematic claim per se. It's more about the speaker and what it reveals about the speaker, right? So it's not a bigger thematic idea per se. You may wish to consider poetic elements such as, there they are. Here's a selection. Do you have to do all of those? No. You could do one or two of those in depth. You could bracket out figurative language into two types of figurative language, right? And do that, right? You could do all three if you wanted to. It's completely up to you, right? So again, another structural model through the depiction of or the use of whatever techniques you're going to examine. The speaker underscores whatever you pinpoint is revealed about the speaker, given the speaker's description of the juggler. What does that look like? Here is a 9, right? And again, the 9 is based not just on the thesis, but on the entire essay. But let's take a look at it, right? Through the utilization of frequent alliteration and somewhat off-kilter rhyme, as well as diction evoking an almost spiritual level of power in reference to the juggler, the speaker creates an image of a juggler managing to overcome gravity, to lift spirits as well as objects, and reveals their own inability to overcome dull, monotonous days, forever lacking brilliance. Seems like a mouthful. I mean, it is a mouthful, right? But guess what? This person did this in 40 minutes, right? And the AP mantra is what? Reward students for what they do well. Your thesis might be a little bit wordier than it would be if you had at AP grading, it's always like, what would the student have done if they had been given 3 hours to compose this essay, right? And they infer that given the quality of the writing that comes in 40 minutes. But notice how this thesis is defining terms, right? So let's look at this first part. The utilization of frequent alliteration and somewhat off-kilter rhyme. That itself is kind of interesting because most students steer away from sound devices like alliteration or consonants or assonance. A lot of students don't want to discuss rhyme because it's tricky to do so, right? The fact that this student got a 9, right, indicates that they were able to do that well. They weren't just saying there's this off-kilter rhyme. They were connecting that off-kilter rhyme to this bigger claim, right? So couple, some sound devices, some off-kilter rhyme, as well as, and notice this is wordy, but it's okay because it's still doing what, you're still defining the terms. They don't say they use diction, which please don't do, right? It says, as well as diction evoking an almost spiritual level of power in reference to the juggler. Wordy, yes, but do I know what the person's getting at? Yeah, I get a sense for that. And then in the argumentation of the body paragraphs, obviously this kid delivered. They got a 9. Right? I mean, maybe, if they had more time, they would have just said as well as spiritual diction. They maybe would have condensed that piece, but whatever. It's a little wordy. You're not going to be penalized for that, right? And here is the way in which this person is kind of responding to that other piece, right? So again, it's that 2-part shuffle, right? The prose prompt is going to look a lot like this. The only difference is, right? In the prose prompt, you'll be looking at a piece of prose, an excerpt from a novel or an excerpt from a play, but it's the same thing. In other words, what are they asking you about? They're asking you to showcase your skills of analysis and argumentation, et cetera, et cetera. Questions? Okay, let's go back to this first one. Plants, right? And I sent you, and we're about to look at, I wanted to give you a chance to look at what a strong response looks like. And before we do that, why don't we read this poem real fast? And then let's take a look at 3 different student levels of responses, right? So here is Olive Senior's 2005 poem, Plants. And notice the prompt, how the poet portrays the complex relationship among the speaker, the implied audience, and plant life. You may wish to consider the author's use of such literary techniques as syntax, diction, and figurative language. Let's take a look at this poem. Plants are deceptive. You see them there looking as if once rooted, they know their places, not like animals, like us, always running around, leaving traces. Yet from the way they breed, and twine, from their exhibitionist and rather prolific nature, we must infer a sinister nod, not to say imperialistic grand design. Perhaps you've regarded as beneath your notice armies of mangrove on the march, roots in the air, clinging tendrils anchoring themselves everywhere. The world is full of shoots bent on conquest, invasive seedlings seeking wide open spaces, material gathered for explosive dispersal in capsules and seed cases. Maybe you haven't quite taken in the colonizing ambitions of hitchhiking burrs on your sweater, surf riding nuts bobbing on ocean, parachuting seeds and other airborne traffic dropping in. And what about those special agents called flowers, dressed, perfumed, and made up for romancing insects, bats, birds, bees, even you? Don't deny it, my dear. I've seen you sniff and exclaim. Believe me, innocent, that sweet fruit, that berry, is nothing more than ovary, the instrument to seduce you into scattering plant progeny. Part of a vast cosmic program that once set in motion cannot be undone, though we become plant food and Earth wind down. They'll outlast us. They were always there, one step ahead of us, plants gone to seed, generating the original profligate, extravagant, reckless, improvident weed. It's a cool poem. So here's the thing with poetry. The reason it's harder is that unlike a piece of prose, you read a piece of prose and you kind of get what it's saying faster, right? A poem, you read through it once and then you want to go back and you want to read through it again, keeping the prompt in mind. And you definitely want to annotate, right? You're not going to sit down and just start magically writing your essay, right? You're going to need to do some quick annotation, right? Scribble your thoughts in the margins, look at the prompt, take 10 or 15 minutes to like hammer out a quick little outline of what you want to say on scrap paper, right? And then you say it, right? Don't start before you have a particular plan, right? And we'll see if we have time for this, right? It's already 2:30. We're going to see where we are in 15, 20 minutes. But right now, before we do that, let's do two things. If you go back, here is that thesis that we looked at, right? This reading of the poem was, the speaker warns the audience not to underestimate the clever machinations of plants, characterizing them as manipulative beings whose goal is to take over the world. A point argued through sinister diction, personification of plant life, and direct addresses the audience. So again, probably a paragraph on sinister diction and or personification of plant life, and then something on the direct audience, address to audience. Fair enough. Let's do this now. What does a really strong essay response look like? And if you go to your email, I sent you that. So if you go to this thing, 2 more AP Lit resources, and you open that second one, plants responses. Okay. I want to give you a little bit of time to read through this, and here's a quick summary of it. This first one gives you the AP scale, the 1 to 9. What does an upper range essay look like? What does an upper mid-range essay look like? And a mid-range, and then you have the lower half essays in a brief description. Then you're going to see that there are 3 essays. The first one is from that first thesis statement that we looked at, right? This first essay, we can look at it. There's a second essay, and then there's a third essay. You can notice that third was very, very short. And then after that, there is a scale. You can skip this page if you want to, this overview. You can skip that, and then this scale gives the AP responses to that, right? The first one got an 8. The second one got a 5, mid-range, you know. The third one got a 3, like kind of inadequate, right? So let me give you about, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes to read the 3 essays, right? And then read the 3 AP responses to the essays. And look at that scale first too, right? Questions for me? Fantastic. All right, I'm gonna pause the. All right. Okay. I'm wondering if y'all could just give me your immediate reaction to the student essays you read. Please. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. 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 So yeah, the third one is clearly and patently weak, and we can all probably agree on that, right? When we look at that third one, there's very little written, right? The introduction says that the thesis says Senior uses similes, metaphors, and personification. Again, there's no real attempt to define what kind of similes or what kind of personification, right? Again, what we've been urging you not to do, define your terms. Don't just use, they use metaphors. Like, what kind of metaphors do you mean? And then there's not an answer to the question to portray a complex relationship with deceptive plants, right? That sort of just repeats the prompt without actually offering a reading of the poem, right? So the third one is clearly weak, right? This person didn't have much to say. The first and the second one, right? Let me ask that question. Was it, when you were reading it, and then after reading the AP response, was it clear why one was stronger than the other? If you were to pinpoint why maybe that first one seems stronger than the second, because those are a little bit closer. And the second one's a solid but not strong one. And Keshav, what are your thoughts about that?
The first one used evidence a lot better than the second one did.
Yeah.
The second one grew from evidence in kind of weird ways that didn't make a lot of sense sometimes. So it kind of was like, it all kind of, to me, went back to the second thesis, was kind of reaching for something that the poem didn't necessarily say.
Yeah. You highlight two things here. The thesis of the first one's a little bit stronger. The analysis for sure. Even in that first body paragraph, right? There is some purposeful unpacking of the particular bits of diction that are being examined. The connotations of sinister, the connotations of conquest and seduce. And notice how here, right, on an essay you have time to develop on your own, your analysis might be a little bit more extensive. Here, it's basically one or two quick sentences of analysis. I'm going to comment on every piece of evidence I cite purposefully, but it's not necessarily overly lengthy, right? And that's okay, because this is a short, you don't have that much time to write this, right? Riley, what did you notice? Yeah. Let's look at the thesis statements, right? The thesis statements here, right? The first one is, I'm going to characterize, warns the audience not to underestimate the clever machinations of plants, characterizing them as manipulative beings whose goal is to take over the world, right? That sounds pretty interesting. And then after that, I'm going to define my terms carefully: sinister diction, personification of plant life, direct address to audience. And those are the very things that are developed, each in its own paragraph. Keshav already mentioned the analysis of evidence, but if we look at the thesis of the second one, right? Let's look at that one. Thus, the poet utilizes irony, personification, and illusions, right? Again, the terms are not as nearly as defined. What do you mean by irony? What do you mean by, okay, personification in what sense? Illusions, what sorts of illusions? That becomes clearer as you get into the essay, right? But it's not like the first one where the terms are very carefully defined. If you look at the thesis statement itself, how plants are an exact portrayal of human actions. Yeah, I mean, it's a plausible reading, but it's not nearly as powerful as the first reading, right? So it really does boil down to, all right, the thesis, the first one's a bit stronger, right? Definitely stronger. The terms are being defined, and then the analysis is also stronger in the body paragraph. So second one, solid, not excellent, right? One of the things that the AP graders mention in this second one is that the writer oftentimes relies on paraphrase, albeit paraphrase that contains some implicit analysis. In other words, a lot of times a quote is used, and then the quote is sort of just repeats what the quote is saying. Now, that's something you've heard from your English teachers, right? And it's probably driven you crazy, right? You've quoted from the text, and then you kind of repackage what the quote says, and your teacher says, you're kind of just repeating what the quote says. You're not really analyzing the text. And the first time you heard that, you probably didn't understand it. Then you met with your teacher, you saw some examples, and now you probably have a better sense. Like, yeah, when I use a quote, I shouldn't just summarize what it's saying, right? I should be analyzing something, analyzing those DDIST elements. You're probably sick of hearing that too, DDIST, but that's what that first essay does much better than the second, right? So the second one's not bad at all. I mean, again, this is like a short period of time, right? 5, I might have given it a 6 or something like that, but the first one is definitely stronger. So in terms of what you're shooting for, that's kind of where we want to get to in terms of that. Other feedback or other things you noticed or other thoughts right now? Let me ask you this question. Where are you in terms of your cognitive ability to be here? Down? I'm getting a little loopy right now myself, right? The original plan was to now like to give you a poem, an AP style prompt, and to have you quickly do a response, not a full response, but a outline response to it. I'm wondering if that's something that's better shaved for those morning optional sessions. Yes, no? You want to kill forward? You want to, how are we doing? I'm asking for feedback and I'm not getting it. I'm getting some nods. I'm going to take by the silence that y'all are tired. Yes? Okay. Okay. So here's what's going to happen, right? I'm not going to be offended. Like, look, obviously, you know, I hate standardized tests anyway, right? I mean, whatever, but they're the realities. You want to do well, etc., right? So here's the thing, right? Next week, I will send out some emails to everyone taking the test about upcoming optional review sessions in the morning, pop-bys, and so on. There's going to be one for the multiple choice for sure, right? There's also a big one for the poetry, right? The open prompt, you can come by pretty much any time. Just talk to your teachers about the text that you're thinking about and whether those are good texts to prepare. In terms of the poetry prompt, right? What we were going to do today was here, one of these two, right? We're going to look at this Haney's Blackberry poem. It's a really good poem, right? But that's, I think, what I will make evident in my email out to everybody. Like, on this day, I'm going to be here on these 2 mornings to discuss responses to Haney's Blackberries, right? Do take advantage of that, right? It's a good idea to practice this a little bit before you just dive in, right? Because you've seen at this point thesis statements, right? Good thesis statements, and okay, this is what a good essay looks like, but it's a good idea to come by, right? And what we'll do in those practice sessions, if there's several of us, we'll just put our thesis statements on the board, we'll workshop those, we'll talk about those. And in terms of what you would end up wanting to do, right, it would be something like, let's see, something like this, right? This number 2, as it says here, right? You can write full essay responses if you want, or as practice, a lot of times it's helpful just to do detailed outline responses, right? Where you have a poetry prompt, right? You put yourself on the clock, right? If you're doing the full essay, 40 minutes. You take 10 to 15 minutes to plan your essay, which means you're annotating the poem, you're scribbling madly, and then you take the rest of that time, 25 minutes, to move forward fast with the knowledge that this is not going to be the most polished piece, but I have a thesis. I've got some, you know, essentially what I'm going to do in the body paragraphs and the evidence that I want to use, and you move forward, right? You know, if you do detailed responses, right, I would say take 20 minutes or so to read and annotate the poem, hammer out a thesis statement, provide topic sentences with for 2 or 3 body paragraphs and what you would use there. Doing that a few times before the test, enormously helpful, and we'll run some optional morning pop-ins for that kind of thing, right? Before you go, I'll draw your attention to one other thing, right? This last essay, all the essays, and in fact, a lot of essays that are 9s, right? You will notice what I mentioned before, right? 1, introductions are not that long. They shouldn't be long. You don't have that much time. This one's, I think, 4 sentences, right? Your intro for all your 3 essays will probably be 3 to 5 sentences. And that's absolutely okay, right? They are going to know there's going to be a streamlined intro, and then they want to see that thesis statement. The strength of this writing is in its body paragraphs, the analysis and argumentation, the close reading of the poem, connecting everything back to the thesis. And then the conclusion doesn't have to be long, right? I would have probably given this one a 9. You know, they give it an 8, but whatever. I mean, it's short, and notice that the conclusion basically just summarizes what was said before. that might be all you have time for, and that's fine, right? You can still get an upper range essay. If you've got a good thesis statement and you have good analysis and argumentation in those body paragraphs, don't worry if your conclusion is not the best conclusion. You can still get an 8 or a 9. This person did, right? And it might just be, but do have some kind of conclusion, right? Last little thing, right? Down here at the bottom, and I'll mention this again later, and certainly those last couple of review sessions. There are some good tips for AP writing here that you can look at, and we won't do all of them, but this is kind of a good thing to think about when you're considering the different AP essays, okay? Do you have any immediate questions for me right now? Brian. I would be like at a bridge skeleton outline. Like I would spend 10 to 15 minutes, no more than 15 minutes, planning what you want to say before you say it, right? So, you know, whereas a skeleton outline that you've done for English classes are really, really detailed, probably be at a bridge version of that. But definitely, you know, don't start writing before you have a thesis statement, right, of some kind, right? And before you get to the thesis statement, first read the prompt carefully, know what it's asking you, and do that crazy annotating of the poem, right? So that you, okay, here's what's going on here. I can focus on these things, right? And that is something that, again, you want to practice on your own, and we'll have some pop-ins for that. Other immediate questions? All right. Well, thank you for coming by on this Friday at the end of the day, at the end of an X day. You're responsible young people. You know, well done, right? You want to do well on this test, right? I know this is not the most fun thing. Emails to come from me. Me and the other English department members are here to help you with this. You can talk to me or anyone else about any part of the test at any time. Look for my heads up about this, and we will we'll see some of you again, I'm sure. Hope this is something. Ta-ta. Have a good day. Enjoy the weekend. Goodbye.